quickly, but that doesn't seem to be in the cards today.
Do you need to mic them up, or? Oh, whoops. I need to get the bio. I'll be right back.
Yeah. This is just the easiest one, so you don't have to worry about the mic up there.
I got the booming professor voice.
Yeah, it's going to go on the internet now. So this part goes up. You can put it pretty much anywhere around here, just as long as this part goes up. Sweet. You can put that wherever you want. It is on.
Actually, don't want to just give that into practice.
Is Eric around?
Higginbotham?
No, Lynn Greenberg.
He is on leave this year.
Yeah, I see him all over the world, so I don't know where he is right now physically.
I told him not to come.
Talks to the if people see him talks to
He lives here in He's up at Dartmouth, backing up, but I'd like to just come on campus.
Yeah.
and teach here.
That was a great hire. American got poached really quickly. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, we really kind of.
But they should.
We were unkind.
Yeah.
But I was like, great hire, so.
Yeah. Hi. Hi. Oh, no problem. Oh no, it's not a problem. No, I'm glad. I'm glad you came and read your books in grad school. So yeah. Well, I was a basketball student, so all the realism and grand strategy stuff back in the day. So. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't have to do it.
Common Room
Wants this new fancy technology.
behind it.
As to why we didn't see a lot of it, I'm just giving the data as to how. And then I want like the students to really start to pick it apart, and I want to encourage a real the cybersecurity
Hello.
academic ecosystem is
Okay. Remember your job today. I'm okay being me because me is highly variable.
I assume
No.
most people are here for free.
No.
I've heard the name before. I've probably quoted him in my things before.
Possibly. Especially if you want that. Like, in other words, like, we can make lots of things happen, but we don't have a lot of office space. So I like to do it when, like, it's meaningful for a colleague, or, you know, there's such a good reason. There are many good reasons, but, like, I don't want to become just like a warehouse. And because we don't, and this applies to any visitor you would like to have here. I mean, they're usually, you know, if a colleague wants it, we'll find a way to make it happen. But with the caveat, we can't pay for people. but we provide office space.
Did you get the Amazon one, or is that the Remarkable one?
I got the Supernote.
The Supernote?
Supernote. I'll send you the
Who
link.
makes that?
It's a Chinese startup. So they got great software, and if you mark up a lot of PDFs,
I do.
It's really
but I was
like-
thinking of the Kindle, because I buy a lot of Amazon Kindle books and I never read them. So I was hoping to force myself to read
what
them.
I love about this is you can download the Kindle app.
Okay, and then it integrates?
It integrates, yeah.
Wow.
I've only I got it when the eye conked out because I thought I'm going to need to read more, but I don't want to read on a computer screen. And I wanted something where I could do a lot of PDFs for easy reading.
I need to do it for the same thing, too, to blow up the text a little bit more.
Yeah, so let's.
That's cool.
I'm gonna gotta make sure I get my. And now I can basically have a notebook where I'm just like.
Oh, wow. It's going to blow up when it tries to read my handwriting, because I went to like Catholic elementary school.
Yeah,
I got beat for like, you know.
I have just terrible handwriting, but I can show you later. It's fun. It's actually worked out pretty well. We're a little behind schedule, so I'm going to introduce you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SSP Wednesday seminar. Taylor Fravel, director of the program. It's great to see all of you. I'm really delighted today to welcome Brandon Valeriano to MIT. He serves as the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Marine Corps University and a Senior Advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0. So like the Internet 2.0, we've got the Commission 2.0. He was most recently the Donald Bren Chair of Military Innovation at the Marine Corps University at the Krulak Center. He's published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and co-authored 2 books on cybersecurity and military strategy. He has testified before Congress and the UK Parliament on cybersecurity issues and served as a senior advisor to the Cyber Solarium Commission, presumably 1.0, which has taken a lead in formulating cyber security strategy as well as sort of the legislative agenda in the United States. Since earning his PhD in political science from Vanderbilt, he's also written articles on a range of other topics, not just international security, but also soccer, diversity, K-pop, and soft power. So we're really delighted to have Brandon here with us today. He's going to talk about the missing cyber thunder run, cyber operations during the Russo-Ukrainian war. Welcome.
K-pop, but I had a recent health crisis, and I came out of that health crisis. You know, some people come with like a different accent. I just hated the music I used to like, so I just started like K-pop for some reason. It got from J-pop to K-pop. So if you want to talk in the Q&A after, I'm happy to talk about cyber, tech, innovation, and K-pop and soft power. It's those topics. Only one topic, my face will light up. The others will be kind of like droopy, but just how things go. And I thank you for inviting me. I thank you, Taylor. You know, I think we graduated at the same time, so we're like the same generation. We're all growing up. We're becoming men. Like, geez, it's. I don't want to be grown up. I don't. Oh.
We even did
We did the first IQRM, which is now what, CQRM or whatever they call it now. I don't know what they renamed it now, but the very first one was out in Arizona. That was fun. Anyways, today I'm going to talk about cyber operations in Ukraine. Obviously, this is a hot topic. I'm sure most of you are here for the free lunch, but a lot of you may be here for the war in Russia and Ukraine, and the kind of analysis of the dog that didn't bark. And that's kind of what I'm going to do here. I'm going to show you the dog that didn't bark, because there still is a lot of debate as to if the dog is barking, but said dog is barking in secret. Said dog is waiting to bark for the bigger dog. I don't know. There's a lot of explanations for why we didn't see cyber operations in Ukraine. And you know, one of the things I was telling Professor Oy before is that I want to encourage better research in this field. I don't mean to be negative, but I don't like where cybersecurity as a field has developed and evolved. It's kind of gone from this hype-based perspective to a lot of great analysis that came out, particularly Professor Chokery's book. And then it's just kind of regressed more recently. So I hope we start to do a little bit better work in the future, a little bit more work on causality, a little bit better interview work, a little bit better strategic work, and a little bit better statistical analysis. And I hope to kind of push you guys that way. But, you know, we need to figure out where we're coming from. And I've given this talk a few times recently, and someone at the end who does statistics asked me, you know, surely as a quantitative social scientist, you don't believe in a crucial case. And I had to admit, yeah, I don't believe in a crucial case. The problem is, in the field and in policy, people make crucial cases. People make these, if you don't see it here, you're not going to see it anywhere, kind of Broadway analogy about certain cases in the real world. And you need to be able to deal with that. You need to be able to understand what they're saying, and sometimes you need to be able to counter what they're saying, because I believe bridging the gap is important, but I also believe that we need to bridge the gap in the right way. I think in some ways, a lot of the cybersecurity and technology people that have bridged the gap have done an Evel Knievel style without a helmet and have crashed into the other side of the ravine. And I hope we do it better in the future. But this quote comes from Cartler and Black, and it was in Foreign Affairs a month and a half after the war started. And there are some great quotes in cybersecurity, particularly in the cyber Pearl Harbor genre. Someone even called cybersecurity cyber Hiroshima. People go out crazy with these analogies, but this is my favorite recently. Russian cyber attacks on government and military command and control centers, logistics and emergency services, and other critical services, such as border control stations, were entirely consistent with a so-called Thunder Run strategy intended to stoke chaos, confusion, uncertainty, and ultimately avoid a costly and protracted war in Ukraine. This is kind of the Battlestar Galactica view of cybersecurity, and I know a lot of you don't get that reference anymore because even Battlestar Galactica is like an old idea at this point. I don't mean the first one, I mean the second one. I think we're like on the third version at this point, but in the second one, the more recent one, the idea was that the Cylons, the invading AI army, took out all the Battlestars because they were connected, they were integrated, they were internet size, whatever you want to call it. And that's kind of the idea here, that there is so much interconnectivity, therefore during the war, of course, cyber is going to be the first tactic used, the first shot fired to take down the opposition. What's funny is they say this even after the war had started when we didn't even really see this. But the idea of a Thunder Run is a Vietnam-era strategy to just kind of blow up a lot of landmines quite quickly. It evolved to a Gulf War strategy more recently, and now it's kind of become this, this Leroy Jenkins, like, we're just going to go out and attack kind of style idea. And that's the idea a lot of policymakers and military strategists have about cybersecurity. People who have worked in government, who have worked with the military or served in the military, know that that's not true, but that's how the popular discourse goes. And that's why it's important to kind of dissect these crucial cases. Whether or not you believe there's a crucial case, this becomes very important. So pundits and academics alike came with grand predictions about the war, starting with a shock and awe. RAND scholars said there would be a cyber shock and awe, and of course, a cyber thunder run enabled by cyber. My buddy Jason Healy out in New York says, a Russian invasion of Ukraine may redefine how we think about cyber conflict because it'll be the first time a state with real cyber capabilities is willing to take risks and put it all on the line. Sadly, Jason Healy has been wrong about just about every quote he's given about cybersecurity. And that's one of the challenges here, is that a lot of people say things. A lot of people make bets, and they never actually test their bet. They never actually collect their bet. You know, they're saying Manchester United is going to win, and they don't check the box score. We really need to check the box scores here, and I think that's kind of what this is an exercise in. We review the war at its 6-month mark, examining the impact of cyber operations on the course of the Russo-Ukrainian war, exploring the severity, the style, and purpose of attacks. The debate speaks to the core theories and assumptions about the future of war and the power of emergent technology. This is not just about cybersecurity. This is a factor for all forms of emergent technology as they confront war. You can write the same article about AI and the Ukrainian war. things are changing. You're starting to see a lot of use and integration of battle networks in the war. But early on, for the first 6 months, AI was basically limited to facial recognition territory of dead bodies. So, these articles written about, the future of AI and, the war in Ukraine were a bit premature. And I think that's kind of indicative of this entire future of war enterprise in many ways. So, overview, cyber strategies, options, Russia's past role, expectations, research methods, results, and discussion. And I always love I love that little image of the tractor trailer pulling the, what do you call it, the Markov? I forget the name of that cruiser they destroyed. But Ukraine has certainly done a number on Russia. The question is, why? How did we get here? But this talk is really indicative of Russian failures. And that could be a conclusion of this talk, that this is just a talk about Russia's failure. It just really depends on where you sit to determine what your belief is about this question. I wrote a book 2018 with my friends Ben Jensen and Ryan Maness, who are part of this article, but here we also added Grace Muller, who's a postdoc at Army Cyber. She's great. She really pushed this project along. But we created a typology of cyber strategies: disruption, espionage, degradation. Disruption is harassment. Espionage, we have divided into long and short-term espionage. And then degradation are the more serious events, the attempts towards destruction. Destruction is a tough word in cybersecurity because quite often when people say destruction in cybersecurity, they mean destruction of data. When I say destruction, I'm thinking of war and destruction of critical infrastructure. So it's a bit of a terminology, but that's kind of the challenge. I believe it's entirely possible to examine cyber operations empirically. I was telling Nasli the story of Minerva. I applied to Minerva like 2013, 2014. They said it's impossible to code cyber operations because they're covert operations. Then the next year I already did it and I already published it, and then they cited that and said, this is what we would like to fund. A lot of people didn't believe you can code covert operations. It's just more difficult, and the payoff is greater, but it's tougher. And then you have to confront the idea of missingness, but that's a whole other question we can tackle later. Russia's cyber profile. So on the bottom, we have the citation. We have the DCID cyber data that we're on version 2.0 now. It's coming out in Cyber Defense Review like next month, but we had it done a year ago. I thought Cyber Defense Review would be quicker, but they ended up being the longest route to publication. I don't know. It was accepted a year ago, though. So we have data from 2000, 2020 of cyber incidents. We code that using news sources, and then we correlate all those news sources with threat intelligence sources. So that's generally our method. We find the events through the news, which is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. There's something there, and then we find the technical threat intelligence report to back up those events. You could do it machine learning. There have been dissertations with machine learning. The problem is, of course, when does the human come? You can have the human at the end after you scrape the data, or you can have the human to kind of identify the corpus you want to scrape. But either way, you're going to need humans. So we've just been using the Virtual Federal Student Service program out of the State Department. And we run this program through NPS, the Naval Postgraduate School. So every year we have 20 interns just hand coding data. So we just went by hand because it's just easier at this point. So Russia is frequently the initiator. They are rarely ever the target. Most cyber incidents are launched for disruption or espionage purposes. They're more of a nuisance than degrading activities. They have done degrade activities, particularly in Ukraine, but they have been very few and far between. They're often not very severe on our severity scale or hostility scale. They have never resulted in a concession from Ukraine. Concessions in cyber, as we talk about in the Cyber Strategy 2018 book, are very rare. The United States is the best at generating concessions. I would say actually Russia is the worst at generating concessions. Private sector attacks and government local authority attacks are more frequently targeted than military actors. Nearly 1/3 of the incidents tried to manipulate the reception of digital information for malicious purposes. So 1/3 of the past incidents have a connection to IO. Those who know the past of the field of cybersecurity know that it was information warfare. Then 9/11 happened, everyone left, and now they came back as cyber war scholars. I prefer the term information warfare. I think we'll go back there eventually in 10 years, so I think that cyber scholars need to keep an eye on and in some ways lead the new revolution of information operations research, but that's a whole other talk. So what did we do? Where did we get this data? We use an entirely different method. I used a method that would be the toughest test on us. I set us up to fail. I knew we wouldn't fail, but I did the best I can to set us up to fail. So Ukraine released SSCIP, I forget what that stands for, but it was basically the cyber group in Ukraine. They were releasing weekly reports from March until May. We mined those weekly reports for cyber events data. Other people have started producing similar analysis, but they're doing it from the news, which of course I've done before. But if you have such a ripe data source, I thought it was useful to use. The other one is Microsoft. Microsoft released a report in April and June. Microsoft has been very important for this war. They have done a lot to protect Ukraine. Unfortunately, from the report's perspective, I believe they are a little bit underdeveloped, but they make their way to kind of be the main character of this war. And that's interesting from identifying the attacks and pinpointing the attacks. So those are our two data sources to get this data about cyber operations in Ukraine. There are 47 incidents between Russia and Ukraine. This leaves out partisans, third-party actors. There's a great analysis to be done of the weekly targeting lists that Ukraine releases to partisans. I don't believe they've been very successful, but that's an interesting avenue. We're leaving out third parties. Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus have been attacked. This is just Russia and Ukraine. This is what the data is really focused on. I'll skip the hypothesis. I know you guys love hypothesis, but we're just not gonna have time, and you can probably guess. The basic idea here though, is the 2022 line. This is the different line. This is the different data. From the past, you have 28 incidents from 2000 to 2020 between Ukraine and Russia. You have 47 in 2022 alone. That is a dramatic uptick, obviously. That's a twofold increase almost. What's interesting though is severity actually goes down. On a 10-point severity scale, that's part of the DCID data, we find that from 2014 to 2020, the severity is 3.2. It goes down to 2.4. The severity scale goes up to 10, but we've never seen anything above a 6. So that's a tough challenge for this idea that, yes, there has been a dramatic uptick in cyber attacks, but to what end? Why? What has that achieved? This is the thing is, and I can throw out his name again because I already mentioned his name, but Jason Healy asked us recently why we don't code every cyber attack. And the thing is, we're not coding cyber attacks, we're coding cyber operations. Cyber operations are bound in time by a target and an operator, an attacker. A cyber attack is just like a bullet shot in World War II. If you were to code every cyber attack, it would be like coding every artillery shell shot in Okinawa, whatever. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we code cyber operations. In that view of cyber operations, in one campaign, you actually see a decrease in severity during the war. That's confounding. Over time, 2000 to 2020, you see, it's not a normal kind of regression line, but you see an uptick in 2015, 2016, which is fairly obvious from reporting during the war. The Crimea phase of the war, 2014, you didn't see a lot of cyber attacks to launch the war, but you did see a lot of critical infrastructure attacks in 2015, 2016. So you see an uptick there. 2022, some of you know, my heart blew up 2 years ago. That looks like my EKG monitor when I was in the hospital. Like, there's no pattern. It's nothing. If that's a war, you would never really guess that from the severity line.
Can you just explain
Yeah, I need to put a table of severity, but I'm also worried that it's going to like degrade the conversation and to stop us because coding severity is a whole other challenge. We code severity on a 10-point scale. We don't just do it amongst the co-authors of the paper. We generally use a team of lieutenant colonels that are at the MPS or before at the Army to vote on the severity scale. Severity goes from 0 to 10, 0 meaning no damage, 1 meaning something happened, but we didn't really see anything. I don't have a lot of great examples off the top of my head. But the most serious are about a 6 so far. That would be a serious degradation of critical infrastructure. Most cyber attacks that you see in the news are about 4 and 5. So either they're combined attacks on a certain target like the State Department, or they're combined attacks on a certain critical infrastructure target. That would be a 5. Espionage, DDoS. DDoS is a 2, espionage is about a 3. So, you know, that's kind of how the severity scale goes. I got to put it in there, but, you know, I always run out of time with these talks too, so I don't know where to go with that. But this is also really interesting. By type, 2000 to 2020, you see, you know, the pie kind of graph, disruption, espionage is green, degrade is yellow. You do see a change during the war, during 2022. The change you see is less espionage. That's fairly obvious because during the war, you're going to lose the long-term espionage category. All the espionage is going to be short-term targeting information. But instead of seeing an increase on the degradation, the more serious attacks, you actually see an increase on the disruption attacks, the more minuscule harassment type attacks. And you start to see this too if you pick apart the threat intelligence research and the technical data, where they both say that the targets have been limited and the malware has been limited. The leveraged malware that have been used against Ukraine has primarily been old style, in some cases 10 years old malware. There have been newer, kind of more advanced attacks, but they're very, very rare. Now, targets. You would expect during a war that the targets would shift from the private sector to the government military sector. In fact, you see the same thing. Pre and post-war, it's basically the same thing. So you see no shift in targets either. Multi-domain operations or coordinated operations. This is the big thing in the Microsoft report. They made a lot of coordinated cyber operations between conventional forces and military forces. And they reported 6 to 7. But they didn't tell you out of how many. So here we have the out of how many, the denominator. It's 47. It's 15%. I think that's significant, but I don't think that's a, you know, change in warfare kind of reporting number. In fact, my co-author, Grace Muller, likes to argue that this is diversionary, that it's a distraction, that you cyber attack a media center and then you bomb it with a conventional operation. I don't really know how to unpack that, but this has been a long-standing debate in cybersecurity as to if cyber attacks are complementary or additive to conventional warfare. After doing this for 10, 12 years, I kind of think the debate was misconstrued in some ways, that we were doing the wrong thing. In some ways, I think cyber is a totally different bucket than this war bucket. But you don't see this sort of coordinated operation when you analyze it. We were looking at multi-domain operations because I'm a social scientist and I try to figure out how to code things. So the best way we found was to code conventional operations by location and cyber operations by location, looking for same time, same place sort of stuff. We find basically the same as Microsoft, which is good, but it's 7 out of 47. I think that's interesting. I think that should be a bucket of cases to analyze deeper. But is this indicative of a change of the future of warfare? No, not so much. Information operations. Here you see information operations actually decrease during the war in the context of cyber operations. I'm not looking at independent information operations. I'm looking at information operations done in conjuncture with cyber operations. I will do information operations in the context of the war without cyber operations. But for now, you saw 30% of Russian cyber operations have an IO component before the war. During the war, you only see 20%. That's important, but it does demonstrate that the Russian active measures way of war is a little bit different during the war. So that's also a confounding finding. This is from a new paper. I just presented this in San Diego the other day. We're doing typical logit regressions looking at escalation. And this has been a long-standing question in the cybersecurity community. Is cyber escalatory? And the answer is kind of, yes. We do find evidence that cyber objectives can be escalatory, meaning that if you use degrade strategies and you target the government or military, that can be two dual conditions that increase the probability of escalation. The problem is those are very, very rare. And I haven't had a chance to go through and count the number of cases. But for cyber escalation to happen, you need a particular confluence of events to happen at the same time. Actually, I want to flip the sign here kind of, so I think we're going to flip from degrade to disruption as a reference category, and I think it actually will go negative. But this is the enduring question, really. What will cyber do? Will it be coercive? In the 2018 book, I argue that no, it's not coercive in the diplomatic or military battlefield. During this war, we're not seeing it be very effective or leveraged to great effect during the war when you should see it leveraged. Then the remaining question is escalation. Will we see further escalation either vertically or horizontally to other allies and targets? We've seen a few instances of this. Latvia and Lithuania have been attacked. Ransomware groups have done an uptick in attacking the United States, but we haven't seen Russian whisper, NetGate, type attacks. So you've actually seen a decrease in Russian state-based attacks on the United States during this war. But there are conditions for escalation. I just don't think they're here in this war based on a larger N analysis. This is a directed dyad level analysis of the rival states who have had cyber attacks. A little bit of a selection effect, but it's the data we have. So you go to war with the data you have, with the data you want. So conclusions and policy implications. So overall, we find that there is an increase in cyber operations during the war, but we don't observe an increase in concessions. I didn't even talk about concessions, but there are 0 concessions by Ukraine, obviously. Much to Russia's chagrin, but Ukraine is not conceding anything. We have seen a decrease in severity, and we did not even see a difference in the targets or methods of access. I didn't go over the methods of access, but you don't see the types of operations change either. We find very little evidence for coordination between cyber and conventional forces. Further escalation is possible. We keep warning of that, but after a year and a month, I think we could probably stop expecting the further escalation of cyber attacks to the United States as a consequence of this war. If anything, I would think that the United States would be the one to escalate to cyber attacks against China if they start to supply the Russians with supplies. So we're not seeing horizontal escalation from Russia, nor are we seeing vertical escalation from Russia. So we're not seeing much evidence of escalation. The central fact remains that cyber operations do not dramatically aid in undertaking a military, diplomatic, or espionage operations in the context of war. So those who argue for a massive transformation or a revolution in warfare have to confront evidence and reality, and that's what I'm doing here. Evidence and reality is important. I've studied military innovation for a long time, and I think one of the greatest kind of findings about military innovation that we don't really talk about is the need for data and evidence. The idea of strategic bombing didn't become important until we started to quantify the impact on gas and supplies. That's an important aspect of innovation. And I think disentangling military innovation as a field from empirical social science has led us down a very, very problematic road. But what about the future? And that's where I want to encourage you, because I get very negative about the cyber war, cyber Pearl Harbor of it all. But there are a lot of remaining questions. Particularly, I really love the question of the Russian bureaucracy. We know that Russia is a very effective cyber operator. We know that their ransomware groups are very effective. We saw the Colonial Pipeline event 2 years ago at this point. People were putting gas in trash bags. You know what happened there? Putin got so upset that that became an international news item that they arrested those people, put their arrest on the internet, and kept them there during the war. You would actually expect them to be quietly let out to kind of unleash hell on Ukraine. You did not even see that. But the questions about the outcome. Why did this outcome happen? That's not really something I can tackle here. I think that's going to take a little bit of time and a little bit of analysis. Interviews, particularly penetrating interviews on the Russian side. I don't know if we'll ever get that. But for one, some people suggest in cyber that the offense has been ascendant for a long time. Jason Healy is very big on that idea. I don't think that was ever true. If anything, you can argue the defense is ascendant. And I know cyber operators in the US government, and they always say in red teaming events, I mean, maybe they're boosting themselves up a little bit, but they argue in red teaming events, the defenders are always better than the attackers. US support was likely critical for this war. Maybe defending forward was the way to go, and that's why we didn't see a lot of attacks from the Russian side. Could also be the partners. Estonia is very important here. NATO, the private sector, the Microsofts of the world. It could also be that Russia is just really bad at cyber. And we got it wrong. And I've said this to the US government many times. A lot of people in the US government say we don't have a cyber problem, we have a Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran problem. I don't think that's true. I don't think we have a Russia problem particularly. I don't think they're very good at cyber in many ways. The other thing is, like, thinking more theoretically from our strategic studies perspective, it's not really a method of coercion nor really a complement to war. The question of why really remains. And I hope to see great research on that in the future. The other thing is, what will other states learn? A lot of people want to talk about the Taiwan of this all. And that's great. I think it's important. I think it's important that we war game out options because we need to prepare. When we were on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, we war gamed 2 options. We war gamed a cyber Pearl Harbor, break glass in case of emergency event, but also I think the more likely event was a death by 1,000 cuts kind of event. The accumulation of small events to lead to a big event. You need to be prepared in government. You need to be prepared for option. It's horrifying to know that even though it was in the NDAA, we still don't have a plan for the continuation of government and the continuation of the economy in the case of a massive cyber disruption. Do I think there'll be a massive cyber disruption to impede all communications in the United States? No. Do I think we should plan for that? Yes, of course we should. We don't have that plan. So gaming out the future, learning from scenarios and building on scenarios based on what has happened here, I think is going to be very important for the future. I'm leaning more personally to the idea of cyber as a human rights issue. I'm leaning more personally that cyber is not useful for state-to-state conflict or contact. It's really only useful for state to individual. The state can coerce the individual, but coercing a state is really more difficult than we've made it out to be. And the last 30 years of research on technology and cyber warfare have purported to suggest evidence for a revolution in warfare, when in reality, we're just finding evidence of evolution of how states coerce the individual. Anywhere from the Chinese social, networks to the evolution of how, the US government is starting to talk about banning TikTok again. This is kind of what's become of cyber. It's become very, very personal rather than very, very aggregate. Unfortunately for Russia and everyone else, cyber operations offer no shortcuts for war. And I think this is the other trend. There is this view that cyber will make war more sanitary. It'll make war easier, That's why I have the theme of a cyber thunder run. The connection between a quick and easy war that will open the gates of Kiev to the reality of what has happened is brutal and eye-opening. War is not changing. War is the same as it's ever been in terms of lethality and brutality, and cyber and AI and drones aren't making it any easier. In fact, they make it more tougher for us to digest because, you know, I'm on the Reddits, I'm on the Twitter, and I see all these individual deaths. And the problem is you're not seeing it used at large to leverage massive effects from a coercive standpoint. But the individual certainly is at risk. What does that mean? What does that mean for the evolution of warfare? What does that mean for the evolution of political science? That's where I'll leave you right now.
So the floor is open. Ron, why don't you start? Everyone else, please keep your hands up especially high, because as some of you know, I'm not seeing quite as clearly as I have in the past. Go ahead, Ron.
All right. One of the things affecting the number of attacks is the relative success of the attacks. And maybe you don't get so many if they don't work. And one of the things which you did not talk about affecting the success of the attacks is the prevalence of effective defensive measures on the Ukrainian side. Because if you look at the internet, it is about 10 times more vulnerable than it ought to be. And it's more vulnerable for very good reasons. It's inconvenient in the extreme to adopt good defensive measures. But maybe Ukrainian critical infrastructure has done that. Could you speak to that a little, maybe?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at with the defense being ascendant. But you're right, I left out like Ukrainian success. When we wrote The Monkey Cage about cyber operations in the war a month after the war started, one thing I noted that I thought was very important is when the war was being prepared, Ukraine was wiring the trenches with World War I style communications. Going back to the Viasat of it all, we didn't talk about Viasat, but that's been a particularly key example for many people who suggest that this is the first, real cyber war. This is the real first space cyber war. The Ukrainians said that they were misinterpreted and that, of course, they don't depend on space-based communications. They, in fact, didn't even have enough modems to access space-based communications. So Ukrainian prudence and resilience, I think, has been very important here. And I think we underestimate the power of the defense in these frameworks because we want to go too far with this power of the offense. And I never like to speak ill of Bob Jervis, but I think the offense-defense, as it's been applied to technology, has been a particularly dead-end road in many ways. So I think we do need to give credit to the Ukrainians. I need to go back and put them back in that list, but I think that's very, very important. There are many, many reasons why Ukraine was successful here. And I guess one of the main lessons I would like the United States government to learn is to organize for the defense, to enable DHS, to enable CISA, to enable the FBI, not so much to invest everything in Cyber Command and the DoD of it all, but to invest in the protection of critical infrastructure, redundancy and resiliency. I think that's critically important.
That reminded me of the agencies. The one most effective thing you can do with critical infrastructure is to never, ever transfer executable control to anything that comes from the outside. And if you do that, it's very effective, but it's also shooting yourself in the foot.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
That is a great example, and it was illustrated like 30 years ago in The Simpsons. But I love it when he got too fat. They put him off in his home to work on the nuclear power plant. And he was pressing the any key, and he caused a whole nuclear incident. And we had a great lesson 30 years ago, and we cannot learn these lessons. There was an example where Washington Post reported a cyber attack on a nuclear power plant from Russia. It turned out the guy was actually on vacation and accessed the nuclear power plant from Russia. Why would you even do that? Why do we even allow that? It just baffles me. The other great example is planes. You can apparently hack into the navigation system from the entertainment system. Why? Why would you connect those two things? It's difficult to do. It's nearly impossible to do. You got to break apart the whole plane while you're flying the plane. But why would you even allow that to be possible? So design is a huge issue. And you see Jen Easterly talk about this right now from CISA, where she's talking about imposing regulations on devices. But figuring out from a policy perspective where you ensure security and how you push security on the user is the tough thing, because we live in a democratic society that doesn't like regulations. So I'm at a wit's end there. But yeah, we could talk for hours about that one. Thank you.
Kanoy, I know you need to teach, and so I want to make sure you...
Sure. No, thanks very much for the talk. What I want to do is push a little bit back on a couple of things. The talk itself focused very much on Russia, Ukraine, and the conclusions that you reached on that were really interesting. My question really goes a little bit beyond that, the extent to which we can generalize. So when we're looking at cyber conflicts in general, it's notable that there are a lot of dogs that aren't barking. Okay, it's not just the Russia-Ukraine one. But if you look at the potential for severe actions, to take that scale, you had some examples of 6s, but not stuff above. And the larger question is, why is it that in the realm of cyber we don't see heavy quasi-kinetic activity, the hard-hitting stuff at infrastructure? Is it because there are no vulnerabilities? Is it because defense is just terrific? Is it because deterrence actually works? And those are three possibilities. I'm noting that Joel, in the back of the room, pulled together a group at CSAIL, Computer Science and AI Lab. And it was an odd mixture of geeks and wonks and people that knew particular sectors. And I have to tell you that those conversations caused my hair to turn gray because of the potential for bad things happening that have not largely happened. So why have cyber dogs not bitten more people? Forget about barking. Mm-hmm. And is it because they don't bite very well? The vulnerabilities aren't there? Is it because defenses are great, or is it deterrence? What's going on?
So let me say three things. Complexity, multi-causality, and generalizability. One, I think there's too much complexity in this domain, and complexity actually saves us in some ways. It's kind of like the Texas energy analogy, that while it's horrible for people in Houston when they have a cold snap, that they don't have the ability to get power from other states, that actually shows that we have a decentralized energy network, and that in many ways can protect us. The complexity of the United States and how vast and how spread out it is, I'm sure a lot of Europeans don't really get that idea. You know, I hear things like, I heard someone say the other day, you know, it's easier for me to fly to London than it is to drive to Florida from Alabama. You know, how vast and big the United States is something in our favor. But as to why we're seeing these outcomes, I think quite often, and this is the tendency of social scientists, but also mainly the tendency of the news, to look for one event. I think it's everything. We have to accept that it's a confluence of all these events at once. We need to figure out, though, how to weigh them from one perspective to the other. And we also need to figure out, from a policy perspective, how to actually get things done. And I've learned this working with the US government and working with the Solarium Commission, that there are pieces of advice and pieces of law that you want to write, and there are pieces of advice and pieces of law that you can actually give that will be effectively implemented. And you need to choose between the two. I would say in cybersecurity, we are 20 to 30 years behind making the right choices. I would hope we're finally making the right choices. But on the other hand, the Biden administration hasn't even released a cyber strategy they wrote 2 years ago. There's a lot of internal discord in the Biden administration on cybersecurity. I hope it's worked out in the next few years, but I'm not too hopeful. As for generalizability, that's why I started the talk with the crucial case example. I don't know how much you can generalize from this case. I'm not sure if you can generalize from this case. The problem is, though, that the way people in this field set this case up, they set it as the test, as the generalizable example. And I think in many ways, sadly, my life would be a lot easier if I was cyber war, cyber war, cyber war. My kind of role in this world is to pop these bubbles. And that hasn't really helped my career very much. It's helped citations, but not my career very much. But in many ways, I'm trying to pop this Ukrainian bubble that a lot of people, I think, got far too ahead of their skis on these examples. And I hope to restrain people a little bit to think a little bit more about causality, effectiveness, but most important, going into the 2018 book I wrote about coercion and how technology may or may not enable coercion. I think there are ways, and you've written about them, economic coercion, the connection between cyber and data regulation, that's evidence of coercion. This is not. And I think we get too far on the security studies side as opposed to the IPE side, which I think in some ways is more interesting.
Haley.
Great. I thought this was really interesting. I have a couple questions that pertain sort of to how you're thinking about, it's basically conceptualization, operationalization questions. So what counts as a cyber operation? You're careful to distinguish between a cyber attack and cyber operation. So how do you know when one starts and one ends? And also relatedly, what counts in your mind as escalation? How do we know escalation when we see it, and how can we attribute it to a cyber attack or something else? And then I wasn't clear when you were talking about the DCID. You mentioned getting event data from newspapers. I was wondering how that, how we think about, or how you were thinking about maybe, I guess, is that how this data set collects this event data? No? Okay, then never mind.
Yeah, I'm just talking about DCID because it is, still to this day, the only peer-reviewed data set of cyber activity. DCID, thank you, Professor Chokri. Naslie's been great, and she's a great influence on our field. In some ways, I think, and I mentioned DCID because it is the example of a peer-reviewed cyber data set. So the way we identify attacks is by first selecting on the cases. So we're looking at rival states. And then we're searching for news events of cyber operations in the rival states. Then we need to make sure there actually were cyber operations, so we need the technicals. So we need 3 things there to code. You could do it the other way, like I mentioned. You could do the machine learning version, but at some point you're going to need to do those 3 steps again anyways, so we just do it the front end. Yeah?
Sorry, just a follow-up. So first looking at the news sources for the event data and then clarifying that happened, is there some sort of concern or how do you think through concerns about media attention to cyber operations or media attention to cyber attacks across the time frame of 2000 to 2022?
Yeah, and actually Leonard Masterich and Don Lindsay and Ron Diebert have an article about the selection effects that go on in this community. And that's a challenge because let's say I got data from Toronto, they have citizen labs, very well known. You would find out that Canada is the most cyber attack state in the world. It's a selection effect problem. You don't see a lot of evidence of attacks on civilian humanitarian groups because the news isn't really interested in them. So yeah, there's a news media bias problem with cyber events data. That's true of any way you would code this. Yuri Zhukov has the term is whatever war is in Ukrainian, but he has a new data set of events in Ukraine that does include cyber, but that's based on the news again. So that's why we ended up by version 2, we're triangulating with actual threat intelligence and actual technical sources. How do we know escalation? It's a rise in severity, so that would be vertical, or a horizontal rise, or an inclusion of other states. So that's how we code severity. But escalation is a very hot topic in this field. Erica Longren and Sean Longren are releasing a book on the Bridging the Gap Oxford series on the theoretical dimensions of escalation. We're going to have an empirical book on the empirical dimensions of escalation. The US government's very interested in that, but I will tell you, particularly the grad students in the room, to not do what people are already doing, but try to anticipate what the questions will be in the next 5 years, because that's where the money's going to be. And I see I/O, I see examining the effectiveness of operations and how to protect critical infrastructure being the key questions the U.S. government's going to be interested in the next 5 years. Right now, there's an escalation, but everyone's producing work on escalation. Whether or not it's a cyber operation, like I said, it's bound by the actor, the time, location. So it's bound by the target. So if you're attacking the same target 3 different times with 3 different versions of malware within 6 months, that's one cyber operation. That would include a multitude, if not thousands, of individual cyber attacks. But you know, cyber attack can mean anything and just about anything to the point where that term is almost useless. As to what a cyber incident is and a cyber operation is, that is actually legally defined in US code. So we use that, and that's in the DCID article. The literature is rich in cybersecurity, but I would also claim it to be very much degenerative. So I find it interesting, but I find the trends moving forward, and Professor Choker and I were talking about this before, the movement or the turn towards survey research in cybersecurity is a bit much, because what does an individual like my mom who like flips out about balloons know about a cyber attack, and why would you survey her? That's a whole question we need to unpack. But gaining an empirical ground on this field, I think, is an advantage, and it's something that we need to do. But it's tough. It's tough to code and examine empirically covert operations. But that's the water's edge, you know?
So on the data set for a minute, I guess 2 follow-up questions. One, do you ever, right, in the technical literature, do you encounter operations that never make it into the news? And then if you're focusing on what makes it in the news, like, what are the implications for the analysis of that selection, right? Does that mean the defense was really good, so operations were launched, they were defeated, never reported? Does that mean they just didn't launch many operations? Like what are, like,
Yeah.
You mentioned the missingness earlier. This seems to be a kind of missingness that would seem to be relevant to some of the questions you're trying to answer.
Definitely. We do have a little bit of that. Ones are, I remember now, are attacks that don't really succeed. They're like attempts. So we do code attempts that the news media does catch and the cyber threat intelligence field does catch. But the whole missingness of things that we don't know about, the cyber and the shadows, my very flippant response is cyber attack falls in the woods. We're looking at the influence on war and foreign policy. So if you don't see it and you don't notice it, what influence does that have on foreign policy? There is a lot to be said about the idea of missingness and selection effects in this data, in this literature. Eric Gardsky's tackling that. Eric Gardsky says that I am J. David Singer in like 1966. And that's where we are in this field. And if people know the history of J. David Singer and the history of correlates of war, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we have to start somewhere.
Thanks. Rich Nielsen.
Oh, hey. Yeah. Enjoyed this. Bunch of questions, but I'll limit myself to 3. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'll limit myself to 1.
So I have my phone ready, because sometimes I get like 5 or 8 questions. And
I'm just sad that our colleague Vipin Narang's not here to actually try to ask 3 questions.
I can email him after.
So, private actors in international relations. One of the stories I hear in this space is that cyber opens up space for private actors. You didn't code them as far as I can see in either of your data sets, but you must have some intuition. The events that stuck out to me in the Ukraine war were the, like Elon Musk tweeting at the, I mean, like, or, I mean, it is plausible though that like a billionaire getting involved in warfare is like a new phenomenon, and then there's you know, Anonymous and other groups, etc., that arguably could have impact both for defense and offense. I'm curious what you think about those, whether it's a big nothing burger, whether limiting yourself to the state-to-state scope is potentially missing things. How are you thinking about that?
I have been encouraging my friends at West Point, particularly Erica Longren, who is now moving to Columbia, to really focus on the private sector actors and the targeting and whether or not they are effective. I don't think I see a lot of effective operations changing things. A good example I'll give you is Belarus trains. A lot of the news media thought early on that Belarusian partisans were derailing trains through cyber attacks. Nothing of the sort was happening. They were physically derailing trains, but that's what the news media thought. So every time you see one of these things where it's like, we're not really sure why this happened, why did Southwest, go down, it generally actually is human frailty or human fault, and we attribute it to digital fault at first, but we actually kind of pinpoint it more towards the localized, someone just messed up sort of thing. I think that's what you're going to find a lot here, but the interesting thing for me, the question for me that results from that is norms and institutions, and how do institutions that are trying to regulate cyber operations and establish legal norms for cyber operations, how do they handle the issue of third-party partisan actors who may be vaguely directed by a state? That's the real interesting challenge, I would say. I had another point, but whatever. Did you have another question?
No, thanks, that was great. I'll follow more, but definitely want to get to it.
If time permits, we'll come back for 4 to 5.
I got a flight at 4:30, so I got until then.
Let's see, Nina Miller.
Yeah, so this actually returns to the discussion we were having about data and potential missingness. And so my understanding of the data you're presenting today is that a lot of them are coming from Ukraine. And this very much paints the story of Ukraine's success. And so my question is if you were concerned about them obfuscating things, because they obviously have a real interest to paint a story of them being successful against Russian onslaughts and being pretty invulnerable. And actually, this is not working, so please stop trying. So do you worry about that at all?
Not really. I view it from the other perspective of Ukraine saying, and they continue to say this, we need ammunition, we need help. And I think that's what they're crying out for help here. They're saying that we're being inundated with cyber attacks and we need support from the international structures for this. So that's the message they're pushing, I believe. But I find the signaling, the perception aspect of cybersecurity entirely interesting and entirely rich. See, this is the sad thing, like Jervis got involved in the cybersecurity, but he didn't do perceptions. So I don't know like why, I didn't want to ask him because it's like tough to ask him at this point, but before he passed. But I didn't want to ask him like, why are you I wanted to ask, why are you not doing perceptions? And I know this from the US government standpoint, and I asked for intelligence assessments of Russian and Chinese behavior, and I was literally told by my admiral, we can get them for you, but you're not going to like them. So it's just like the quality of what's going on there is not as much as we would hope. So there is something to be said about investigating how people feel and react to cyber attacks, and I find that entirely interesting. I'm not so sure we should do it through surveys, but definitely through experiments. Daphne Canetti and I'm forgetting his name, Michael Gross, have done a lot of great work on individual biological reactions to being hacked. This is something you can do in Israel. You can run an experiment in Israel and tell someone they're being hacked and then do an amylase like test of stress levels. I don't think you can get that away with here. I find that entirely cool, and I think that's really interesting to look at how people actually react. And then that goes to the whole leadership of it all. How is the leadership going to react? How would Joe Biden react to something like this versus Pete Buttigieg? Would Biden understand? I'm not saying he's old, but I'm saying he's before the digital generation. So I think there is a cutoff point, and I think literally I am the cutoff point. I was in Catholic school when Apple IIes came out, and they said, Brandon, we can't keep you in class anymore. You ask too many questions. Just go in the computer room. So I was like the first generation of that. So people behind me are very much digital natives. But before that, there's really a question of how much they can uptake and understand about these issues before you start talking the internet, like saying the internet's a series of tubes. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot there.
Maybe age is actually an advantage in responding to
that. That's a whole other, maybe.
What, do you worry? Like
why would you worry if you don't understand it?
Jim Walsh.
I enjoyed this talk very much. And I'm going to ask you a question you probably already thought a lot about, but didn't have time to discuss. This might be, your results may say something about cyber, the utility of cyber warfare, or they may be saying something about Russia in particular, probably both. But it makes me wonder what, in a thumbnail way, you can tell us about the organization, where is it that the military side of the Russian military fits into the organization that is the broader Russian military that is in theory being integrated? In other words, Russia's had lots of problems. Is cyber another problem they are having, along with others, or are these really sort of different problems? The logistics problem is different than the cyber problem, or they're in different buckets or whatever. But is it telling, what about, is how a state organizes to deploy that important in this?
I think it's incredibly important. And, I'll be honest, I'm leaving the Marine Corps. I have a job offer at NDU, Joint Combined, I don't even know where I have a job offer from. Joint Combined, what is it, FC, SC? No, Warfighting School. We have an entire school for that, for combined operations. How far are we? Not very far. We have ideas and doctrine about how to plan for joint operations, but we don't have a lot of directives for this is the package you're going to deploy at this point in this time. And actually, that's a challenge with cyber because it's very time dependent and target dependent. And one of the things I've always wanted to do, and I would love to do, and I think I could do this right now if I just had more free time, is to survey cyber planners and look at the effectiveness, their view of effectiveness of operations, and get back to this idea of operations research. In PME, we have a large structure to do operations research. It was an entire enterprise and academic focus for generations. And then we got to modern technology like AI, IO, and cyber, and we're just like, oh, it works, it all works, it's great, like war, this is the future, and we don't have a sense of operations research anymore. So really, I think the problem is that if you were to talk to planners, and I know this to be true from the ones I've talked to, even the best would have very skewed views about how successful their operations will be, anywhere from 30 to 60%. This is the United States. This is the best of the best. So even the best planners are going to have concerns about the viability of their operations in the wild. Stuxnet's a great case. Stuxnet, the attack on the Israeli Knots plant, the Iranian Knots plant by Israel and the United States. That's a great case, but it's also a story of a lot of luck. That you had to have someone on the inside. I think the Dutch put someone on the inside. We intercepted centrifuges from Khan and the Pakistanis so we can run operations before we even got there. And then even then, the Iranians actually enrich more uranium than after because, of course, you blow something up and you destroy their math, they fix it and they get better at it. So then they started to do the attacks with they did the really cool attack where they put a dynamite or munitions in concrete and they gave up on the cyber. So whether or not you think it'll be effective is really the interesting bureaucratic question. But in some ways, I'm trying to use this talk to punctuate that myth that this is easy, that even when you should see it, you don't see it. But as you point out, we have the Russia problem of it all. Russia could just be bad at all this. They're bad at war. They're bad at everything. But, people are making this the crucial case. So I'm going to tear it apart as a crucial case. But there's other things that we can do to study the evolution of cyber warfare from a bureaucratic perspective. And I think that's entirely legitimate and interesting.
Kunal Singh.
Thank you. I think many people have asked questions about data gathering exercise, and so I'll try to make it sound as a new question. So at one point you said Russia is generally the initiator and not the target of the attacks, but many of the news sources actually have the sources within the governments of the US or those countries where Russia would be attacking, and not have the same level of sources in the Russian government. So do you think it's just reflecting this kind of a selection bias where the media has sources within the government? And at the second level, those sources are more likely to reveal these attacks once these are ineffective. Mm-hmm. If they're embarrassing, they won't reveal it. If they have really got some information or damaged something. So who is it attacking and who gets attacked and what is the effectiveness? Are both not getting compromised with this election effect?
So one of the challenges, though, would be that if you had better sources from the Russian side on cyber operations, you would actually report more failures and less severity than I even find here. That's why I chose, and getting back to your question, that's why I chose the Ukraine of it all. Because to me, I was really interested in what Ukraine was reporting. Sorry, I know I don't say Ukraine right. It's just, you know, I can't pronounce things. But I was really interested in what Ukraine was reporting because they're trying to estimate, like, we need help. We're not surviving here. You know, also remember the timeline here. This is, you know, up until May. This is up until the Kharkiv, now I'm unsure everything I'm pronouncing, of the Kharkiv offensive. So things changed at that point. But what you're asking for would actually just provide more evidence, I would say, to support my position. But that's the challenge of investigating covert operations. What about the wars that didn't happen? What about the fashodas that we don't know about? What about the times that not just Nixon was drunk, but Khrushchev was drunk and, you know, thought about launching a nuclear operation? You know, those horrific things that we don't know about, in some ways we're better off not knowing about it. But once you start unpacking the what do we know and what do we don't know kind of aspect of international relations, the whole entire enterprise of what we do kind of falls apart. I've always struggled with the whole selection effects of it all, because I started with rivalry, which of course is an entirely utter selection effect. But in some ways, I think sometimes picking a bucket of something you want to analyze and focusing on it gives you a lot of analytical leverage to know a lot about something, and then you could take a wider aperture and look, you know, from a deeper perspective. But like I said, according to Eric Gardsky, this is like correlates of war data 1966. We have 50 more years to go. I hope cybersecurity as a field doesn't last for 50 more years. I hope what I helped create doesn't last that long. Sad to say, because I don't think it's entirely founded on any sort of, I don't think cyber is a domain. I think it's more of a cognitive domain or a physical structure. But where we go as a field is the interesting question, and the whole selection effect of it all is a challenging question. But on the other hand, you have a lot of people who are operating without any data or evidence at all. It's just a lot of feeling, you know, and it gets to a lot of like, it gets to a lot of what you're hearing about like Jan 6 and things like that, where people are talking about how they feel about something. And I feel the cyber operations are working. And that's kind of what you get from this other side, which is just even worse. So pick your poison, I guess is my answer.
Very present.
So I learned a lot from this talk. I'm interested in the 7 of 47 cases that you suggested may have involved a cyber attack or a cyber operation coordinated with some more conventional looking attack or operation. I'm pretty ignorant about cyber, and so I guess it would be helpful to me to get a little color on some of those incidents. Like, do they simply appear to be accidents, accidental correlations? Or do you have some evidence where there were some number of cases where the cyber attack really does appear to have some functional relationship to the other operations that were going on? And how effective was that connection, if you saw it?
So I think there is a functional relationship, but it's a functional relationship of this week we decided to go after communications. This week we decided to go after the media. So you have someone directing and someone saying, this is what we're doing from a conventional standpoint, this is what we're doing from a cyber standpoint. I don't think they're actually coordinating, but they're picking the same target at the same time. So the example was the attack where they blew up their communications tower. They cyber attacked that before. If you were doing that from a coordinated perspective, why would you blow the cyber? Why would you do, you know, the intelligence gain loss challenge? Why would you give up that malware when you're going to blow it up? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I don't see coordination, but I see multi-domain operations at the same time. The other example is the nuclear power plant. They cyber attacked the nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia, before they actually took it over. Did that enable them to help take it over? I don't really know, but there are examples throughout history, particularly the main one is Syria. When Israel attacked the Syria nuclear power plant, a lot of people believe there was a cyber attack that shut down the missile defense systems. I think it came out later that that was an actual person, an insider that just did that. So the belief that it's cyber helps people believe that there's something there, that there's a possibility for coordination, but planning for coordination and doing it on a certain day, at a certain time, at a certain level, that's where the bridge is right now. That's where we're kind of stuck right now. That we know how to plan for joint operations, But actually launching joint operations is a struggle. And then you also have the bureaucracy of America, where Cyber Command is a bit off on its own. And even in the CIA and NSA, the cyber capabilities are not necessarily connected to other operational capabilities. So this is a challenge for us as we move forward into the future. Joint planning is tough for America. Do we think the Russians can do it? I don't think so.
It wasn't at the beginning of the war, but in the last several months, there have been a series of waves of attacks on the power grid. And from my ignorant perspective, coordination with cyber operations might have been, at least it's a light you would have looked under. In other words, it seems plausible that you could get some sort of a 1-2 punch out of combining these things. Has that occurred, or do they seem to not have occurred, or even have been coincident?
It has not occurred. I need to unpack that because I believe there is now emerging data sets of these critical infrastructure attacks on energy. Yeah, there are. And to see if there actually is coordination. But I think once we do unpack that, we're going to find very few incidents for 2 reasons. One, malware that impacts critical infrastructure, particularly energy critical infrastructure, is very valuable and very much tailored for the target. Why would you do that and waste that capability when you can use a cheap $20,000 Iranian, drone with a moped? That's one challenge. The other one, of course, is in the history of critical infrastructure attacks on Ukraine. This goes to the complexity saving them. The Ukrainian systems were so old, they just went and flipped the switch and they turned them back on. So, I mean, you can have a Wired article about, hey, they turned down the energy, they lost power, but then you actually look at the details and they lost power from midnight to 3 a.m. until, Yuri drove his truck out to the middle of nowhere and flipped the switch like it's Jurassic Park. So that's kind of what happened there. So
I think there's a little more fragility in that system than you suggest.
yeah, but it's endured.
It's endured because there's so much capacity.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting thing is the Georgia Tech team with John Lindsay and Nadia Koshyuk is looking at internet and how the internet stayed up. And of course, one of the reasons the internet stayed up is because Russians bought such bad equipment. They needed the Ukrainian internet to stay up. But the endurance of the Ukrainian internet during this entire war is entirely confounding to a lot of people. And the question of why it stayed up is an interesting research question. So,
if I were interested in doing a grid attack that was actually going to bring the grid down, it seems to me that I would want to do something to the Ukrainian energy authorities' information infrastructure to make it hard for them to coordinate the repair of the grid. So that's a light I would look under, and it sounds to me like you have and you've seen nothing.
One, I will say that's a very American perspective where we have a lot of military infrastructure and abilities and capabilities to do that. But 2, I also mentioned the intelligence gain loss calculation. That's a really interesting thing that we never really kind of empirically examined, and it's just kind of like a folkway in the intelligence community. But why would you lose a capability when you can use a conventional capability to do the exact same thing? That's the challenge. Ken, did you want to say?
So following directly on Barry's question, to what extent was the Ukrainian grid integrated with internet, with vulnerabilities to the extent that the American one is? And I put that question to you because when Joel Brenner put together a really interesting study on critical infrastructure, including the grid, the points that were scary were actually not the primitive stuff. It was actually the more sophisticated the control systems and interlinks, the greater the vulnerabilities. In fact, the more sophisticated the safeguards, oftentimes, those were the points to be attacked. And are we talking here about a grid that may have actually lacked some of the critical features for attack because it was too old or less sophisticated?
I got another 2-finger on this before you respond.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dan?
Yeah, so I guess on like the Ukraine, 2015, 2016, where there's like a flip the switch, part of that also was like the malware didn't execute properly, right? There's a segment of the malware that didn't execute. If it had, they would have just been able to flip the switch. So that's a bit misleading. Yeah. I think also, this is on that point too, like to your question, why would they burn the malware capability? You also then said well, each malware has to be designed specifically for each critical infrastructure site, right? So it's not like they're burning that capability necessarily, maybe like the access, because it's specifically tailored to that site anyway, because it has to connect to the IT and the operational technology, right? So like, I'm a bit confused about, oh, well, why would they burn this? Like, when you say they're burning malware, in my mind, and maybe I just don't know enough about like the technical side, are they actually burning malware, like, to get into the system and then elevate to like systems level? Or are you saying like, in general, there's some commonality among all of these systems where it actually does matter that they burn for each individual site they attack, right? Because in my mind, if it's specifically tailored for each site, then they're not really burning anything.
It does matter because you have malware families. So once you cultivate a method of access, a way of breaking in, what was the one in the United States? And I should know, I've read like 8 op-eds on the whole thing. Was it Whispergate or Whispernet? I forget. Once you're able to get in, that allows for other forms of access. But if you stop that ability to get in the first place, all those forms of access are gone. That's the challenge in some ways. I don't know a lot about Ukrainian critical infrastructure, sorry to say. But this goes to the Viasat of it all, like I mentioned, the space-based attack, where they kind of said, like, what are you crazy? You think we have space-based modems in every tank? Like, no, of course not. So yes, the antiquated nature of the Ukrainian state, and maybe even the corruption in the Ukrainian state, maybe did help them survive. But it's not like a policy advice we can give to other states. And it is a challenge for us moving forward, and that's why I'm particularly concerned about the DHS of it all, where I don't think we're enabling CISA to do what it needs to do, because we're focused too much on the cyber command of it all.
I'm not walking up.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
I'm going to go teach. Thanks very much.
So we've got 3 folks left on the list. I'm going to ask them to each ask their question and then turn it back to you to pick and choose. So Zach, Burdette, Linda, and Phil on.
Awesome. Thanks for the talk. So I think in your concluding slide and in the Q&A, we've laid out a few hypotheses about why this outcome has occurred. And I'm not going to ask you to explain why exactly, because I know you haven't done the research. But I think the 3 main ones are that the Russians just are kind of uniquely bad at this. The defense is dominant, partly maybe because of reasons like defend forward or public-private partnerships. And then the third is the Ukrainians are just less vulnerable because of their antiquated infrastructure, right? And I agree with your response to Ken that multi-causality is important. It's probably a little column A, B, and C. But it seems like whether it's like a even Stevens 30-30-30 split, or it's like 80% the Russians are just really bad, and then a little bit of defensive advantages, that distribution really matters. So what I'm curious about is, do you have theoretical priors, like based on your analytic frameworks you're applying to this, about what matters most? And if you were to try and test what is explaining most of the outcome here, what kind of evidence would you actually look for to say it's this and not that, rather than just like, the Russians made some mistakes?
Hold your response, Ellen.
Yeah, thank you. So very interesting talk. I feel like my question was a bit in a different direction, so apologies for opening up this. But I was wondering what you can say about like the challenge of attribution in all of this, because like how, I have the impression that this is a big debate, the extent to which whoever we are, know like who's responsible for these attacks. So I wonder like, is attribution really that much of a challenge, and how does that perhaps also impact the way that you go about like doing research about these kinds of things?
Bill?
So I have a very selfish question. You don't have to answer this because the other 2 are interesting, but I've been in the area of trying to hire cyber experts, and from my perspective, I'm at the Naval War College, and that there was just an influence of a bunch of quacks. And so the question is, how do you differentiate a cyber expert from a non-cyber expert in this field if you want to hire one? I've used trust. So I know John Lindsay, I know a couple that I trust, but what are the characteristics of an actual cyber expert that you actually believe what they present?
I love your question the most, and it's a deeply personal question to me. There's a thing, and I think I've been shocking the junior colleagues lately, because like I've admitted, like there's a chat between like me and John Lindsay and other people where we talk about these things. And there are names and there are people that we know that if you mention them as your source, you know it's going to go off the rails. And the best example is, I cannot count how many times I've been into a general's office and they've shown me Ghost Fleet as their knowledge of cyber. That's sign number 1. Sign number 2, you were in the room. I've heard this from a certain person and many, many people. They may be in DC at the other PME school in DC, where they say, I was there. What they mean by I was there is I was watching it on Twitter or Slack. I wasn't really there. 3 is actually looking at their background and who they've actually worked for. Because there are a lot of people that suggest they have credentials for certain things, and then you talk to the security researcher and it all falls apart, and it turns out they really weren't in Papua New Guinea pooping in a bag on the side of a mountain like they said they were. You know, these are the types of stories that people like to tell. It's embellishing. It's when you become the main character in this. I admit quite freely that if I had said certain things in a different direction, my life would be a lot easier. It's the people who aren't humble about what they say in this field that are the problem in some ways. Priors. My prior is coercion. Wrote the cyber strategy book. I don't think coercion is effective. I would want to see military plans from Russia early on to leverage cyber in coordination with conventional attacks. Will we ever see that? I doubt it, but maybe in 50 years it might eventually come out, but I don't think they planned that well for the war. Does that mean that Russia sucks? Or does that mean they're unable to do joint combined operations planning? That's a question we have to judge for ourselves, and that's why I think this stuff is so interesting. Attribution, for God's sakes, no, it's a horrible, horrible issue because people think it's so important, and then you actually talk to the cyber operators who do this from day to day, and they will tell you that attribution isn't a big problem because you get to know who's on the other side. You're battling with them daily. You see them theoretically daily. You operate with them daily. There's a style to the language. There's a style to when they work and when they take time off and whether they work at night or in the morning. Attribution is not so much difficult for government forces, but it is for third-party proxy sources. And the water's edge is really what is really a third party and what is really just a government contractor. And I don't even know how to do that anymore because I heard NSA is like, at this point, 3 times more contractors than conventional government forces, people at this point. I don't know. So that's the challenge really is who's a contractor and who isn't really in some ways. But during, not to bring up 2016, but I'm gonna bring up 2016, they have evidence of the hackers who did a lot of that stuff who were logging in from the Starbucks across the street, from the GRU building. So do we need attribution? It's right across the street. I mean, there you go. So.
With that, please join me in thanking Banner for a terrific talk.
Thank you for having me.
Now Ghost Fleet is problematic for yet another reason. Because most people take it as an accurate description of how China will fight. Right?
I mean, I was just talking to Jim Lewis, and like the difference in fiction to describe how policy needs to work and fiction to plan policy is a vast problem for some people.
Yeah, she's not here today, but Kelly Greenhill's got a really interesting book project on.
Oh yeah, I love Kelly's work.
How novels perception before World War I.